Jerry, what inspired you to make such an epic voyage?
It was really a concern for the balance of nature down in the Great Southern Ocean. It seems that with all eyes of the world focused on Antarctica, with a view to exploiting the resources, it's very necessary to keep an eye on the environment and make sure that the balance of nature isn't unduly upset.
Have you always had this interest in this balance of nature?
Yes, I have really, but I'm particularly interested in birds, and in this case in seabirds.
When did you get this interest in seabirds?
Oh, I think when I first went sailing in my small boat Katiga, which was 21 feet, and I sailed down to our subantarctic islands in her in 1972, and alone. And I saw that there were problems there where introduced predators have forced seabirds off their breeding places. But I just love birds, and going to sea without seabirds wouldn't be much fun at all.
You mentioned introduced predators, but you haven't really mentioned the man-made predators, I guess, of some of the seabirds and that, the balance of ecology. This is something that really does concern you, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The predators, of course, are introduced by man, the rats, cats, and so on islands where they weren't before. And the seabirds who've been there for centuries, for millions of years probably, just can't cope with such interference. And so we find that more than half the places where they were able to breed before have now been denied to them. And as seabirds are very much a part of the biological food chain on which all life depends, then it's very important that we should take steps to protect them and make sure that they can continue. She's about 10 meters long. She's built of good New Zealand kauri. I built her myself. It took 7 years to build her.
Did you have any experience in shipbuilding before?
No, only in building the first one that I had, the plywood 21-footer. But I learnt as I went along, and I'm very slow. That's why it took 7 years to build her.
Was it difficult to get the kauri? I mean, it's sometimes rather hard, isn't it?
Well, up in the north, there was a time when it was very hard to get, but then the forestry department said that with ordinary forestry practices of culling old trees or thinning out stands of new young trees, there was enough for just boat building. And so that didn't hurt my conscience at all then to use the little bit that I took for that purpose.
She's quite a sturdy boat then.
Oh yes, I think so. I took particular care to make her very, very strong, and much more strongly than one would expect for, well, a bird that was just sailing around the world in more normal sort of latitudes.
Well, you were obviously going into areas where there was going to be ice and the possibility of that sort of damaging the boat. I suppose you must have had that in mind.
Oh, yes, indeed. And I did know, too, that we were going into the worst seas in the world as far as weather is concerned and as far as the size of the waves is concerned. In fact, in the pilot book, it tells us that near Kerguelen Island in winter, we can expect waves up to 35 meters in height.
Had you experienced those before?
Never, and...
Didn't that frighten you, though?
Oh, it did, yes, very much.
And yet you still, carried on and made the voyage.
Yes, I must admit there were times when I was in that sort of sea that I did have my doubts.
Too late to go back, though.
Yes.
Was it difficult to get crew for such a long voyage?
Well, it was impossible to get crew for the whole length of the voyage because, of course, not many people can just abandon their work and come. And certainly many people, ornithologists, whom I'd especially wanted to come, were rather scared of the size of the boat in the Southern Ocean. But I eventually had really fine people who came along. Those who did come were all in full knowledge of what they were letting themselves in for, and yet they came and endured discomforts. Certainly there's no great comfort in a boat of that length, especially in the Southern Ocean. Cold and wet and dangers without complaint, and because they were keen on what we were doing. So I was very, very lucky, had really extremely good people.
Were they all interested in birds, though?
Well, those who weren't to start with soon were. They just couldn't help it. It was sort of infectious, that kind of an interest. And
well, exactly where did the voyage take you?
Kerikeri down to Auckland and then down to Chatham Islands. And then from Chatham's we went down to the Antarctic convergence, which is down about 56 degrees south, across the Pacific, and then up to Robinson Crusoe Island and the Juan Fernandez group. That was a little bit out of our area, but it was very interesting to us from the bird point of view. And then we did the magnificent Chilean archipelago, which stretches from Puerto Montt right down to Cape Horn, about 1,000 miles of thousands of islands and intricate channels and waterways and fjords and glaciers. And oh, it's a fantastic place, absolutely beautiful, and almost entirely unspoiled. Very lightly inhabited. In fact, there are hundreds of miles with no settlements, no people at all. And the outer islands, which are exposed and rather inaccessible because of the weather and the sea conditions, had hardly been visited by anybody, let alone ornithologists, so it was really extremely interesting to us.
Whereabouts from there?
And then, well, we spent a lot of time around Cape Horn, where we actually camped on the very peak, and spent 10 days there, anchored in the lee of the Cape. And then we went across to Falkland Islands and South Georgia, which is an Antarctic island. In the winter, when we were there, it was mostly covered with ice and snow. And we spent the whole of the winter there, and then came back to southern Chile, did a bit more work around Cape Horn, and then down to the Antarctic Peninsula in April. But we couldn't go very far because we were blocked by the pack ice. In fact, we were very, very nearly trapped by the pack ice and had a job to escape from it. Then, after that, we went back over to South Georgia for another winter, counting king penguins and wandering albatross chicks.
I've seen a photograph of that. It must have been rather difficult to count those chicks.
Oh, it was, but it was tremendous fun. We really enjoyed that.
How, did you come up with a final figure?
Well, I can't remember exactly the total figure for the whole lot, but one colony alone had 34,000 chicks. That was the biggest one.
And you managed to count them all?
We counted them one by one.
Whereabouts from there, Jerry?
And then we went on down to the South Sandwich Islands, again at rather the wrong time of year, but we wanted to see if there were king penguins nesting there. And we went there in September, when they're usually surrounded by the pack ice, and we did in fact actually hit the pack and only managed to land on the northern ones. We couldn't land on the southern, and we then made our escape and sailed up towards Bouvet, which is the most remote island on the whole of the Earth's surface, farthest away from any other land. On the way we had terrible storms, many knockdowns, and in actual fact it was one of the more dangerous parts of the voyage because we suffered mostly from icing on board, which made the boat very top-heavy and really in quite a dangerous state. But we made it to Bouvet, which was a wild place, completely covered by ice, and unfortunately we were not able to land there. We stayed there for 4 days and then made our way on up to Cape Town. We had to make repairs. We'd hit ice several times and we damaged the boat a bit and broken the bowsprit and a few things like that, nothing terribly serious. But we had to make repairs and also change the crew, get more stores. And then after Cape Town, we set off down towards the Prince Edward Island group, which is owned by South Africa, and Marion Island in particular has a meteorological station on it, manned by young South Africans, 9 of them. But on the way there, we had a very bad storm indeed, south of the Agulhas Bank, and lost our mast. We were capsized, turned upside down a couple of times, and lost the mast, which we couldn't save on that occasion. Once before, previously, in the South Atlantic, we'd lost it, but were able to save it and get it repaired at Falklands. But this time we had to just cut it adrift to save the boat. And so then sailed under jury rig towards Marion, and made that quite safely. And there I left my crew as shipwrecked mariners accepted by the South African government, and sailed on under jury rig, just a very small mast made of 2-inch water pipe, sailed on towards Crozet Island. Andreas said to me, "It will be important that you should go to look for the giant petrel's nests, as you never give up." I took that as a compliment. So, leaving Corky to look after Totorore, with instructions to cast off and anchor out in the centre of the collator if the wind increased in strength, Andreas and I went ashore with a tent and other survival gear and food, just in case it was too difficult to get back on board when we came back. And here started one of the most exciting and thrilling days of the whole of this expedition so far. Although we had tried to spot the best route up to the ridge from the other side of the crater, we found that there definitely was no good way. From the start it was tough going. What looks like grass swaying in the breeze is actually the tops of rushes, which poke through the canopy of dense scrub, which is somewhere between 4 and 8 feet off the ground itself. Some of the bushes were tangled, prickly things, and some were tight and cushiony. They were the best to walk on, and the rushes usually indicated the best places and provided handholds. Practice makes perfect, but we never attained that degree of skill and kept tripping and falling. The light green patches with dead sticks were the worst, as some of those had even deeper holes with evil-smelling muddy water at the bottom and had nothing firm to tread on. When one disappeared below the canopy, it was a painful, time-consuming business trying to get back on top, as the branches tangled around legs and arms, sometimes preventing all movement. It seemed an impossible and exhausting task. Progress was extremely slow. I'll just wait for this squall. That's better. When we were at an altitude of about 100 meters, we started noticing small patches covered with feathers, where some small birds had been killed by the skuas or some other birds of prey. They became quite numerous, and when we saw a skua seated on a firm matted platform, we approached to see if it was a midden. It allowed us to approach to within a couple of meters, and we were able to admire the rich rufous and cinnamon color of this large bird, which is called the Chilean skua. Sure enough, when it flew away, we found a collection of disgorged pellets of feathers and small bones, and were lucky enough to find a skull of a small petrel. This was very interesting, as it probably indicated a breeding species. As we plodded wearily upwards, we came across more and more of the middens, and we made quite a collection of parts of birds, and obviously of the same species. And it certainly looked like a prion. Most exciting, really, because there are no records of prions nesting in Chile. When we stopped to eat our lunch, we were looking aloft to watch the giant petrels, some of which were definitely landing high up in the scrub, and we heard a low crooning noise from underneath us. That sounded suspiciously like a petrel in a burrow. We parted the scrub and peered down into the darkness below, all wet and mossy, but we couldn't see anything at all. Wait until it calls again. And sure enough it did, or at least somebody did from down below underneath us, but it sounded like in a different place. And then we waited and waited while we ate our lunch, and we heard yet another one, and it sounded in a slightly different place, right underneath where Andreas was sitting. Well, this was just too much. We just had to go into this, and so this time we parted the scrub, and Andreas disappeared down into it head first. He looked very amusing. And then he got himself stuck in a position, and I had to help him come out, or rather help him extricate himself from all the branches. But he tried again and went down and got his head right down in low, and then I joined him down in a hole right next to him, and we prodded and probed, and we found lots of burrows down there, but there was no sign of occupation, and we just had no idea and couldn't really tell where the birds possibly were, and they didn't make any more sound. Well, after spending some time at that, I was getting rather anxious about the time, because definitely had to get to the top of the ridge and find these giant petrels and see if they really were breeding up there, and then have time enough to get down again before dark. So I said, we'll have to come back up here and look for these prions with some tools so we can cut some of this scrub and we can really make a proper job of it. We've got to be able to get into them, and we'll be properly prepared and make this a separate project. So on we went again, slowly, painfully, but determinedly creeping up towards the ridge on the top. After about 3 hours, we hardly seemed to have made any progress at all, but we struggled on. We were beginning to have some doubts. It certainly looked very unusual behavior. These giant petrels kept swooping around. Sometimes they swooped fairly low over us, and it was wonderful to hear the great whooshing noise of their wings as they went past. They're really magnificent flyers, even if they do have rather ugly faces. Anyway, as we got on a bit farther, we kept saying, they're all landing down in that one place, but then flying away again rather quickly. Could it be that there's just something there to attract them, something like a body? Because they are carrion eaters, but we couldn't think of anything that would be big enough that could possibly be on this island that could attract so many. Anyway, there was only one way to find out, and that was to go up and see. And then, at about 190 meters up, we were just examining a midden of a skewer and finding a few more bones, and suddenly I said to Andreas, look over there, there's a pollo, that means chick. And sure enough, there in the grass we could see a great big round, very fluffy, downy looking chick of a giant petrel. Oh, it was just a wonderful moment. I was just so thrilled. I almost threw my arms around Andreas. I said to him, look, all our trouble, it's so worthwhile. This is the very best thing we've found yet. Giant petrels have never been known to breed in Chile. Nobody knows that they breed here. They think the nearest possible place for their breeding is in South Georgia, on the South Shetlands and South Orkney Islands. This is an amazing discovery, and it's wonderful. Well, we approached close, and then I said, look, there's another. And then we saw another. There were 3 in a bit of a group. Well, this was fantastic. It just made my day. In fact, it made my month, made my year. This was terrific. So anyway, I got my camera out. That was the first thing, the very first one. I said, we'll probably see more, but there's none like the first. So I took a picture of it. And then I asked Andreas to go close to it, and in between that and the next one, so I could take a picture of him with them. But he was a little bit scared because they can spit their foul-smelling oil quite a distance. Actually, these chicks, although they made sort of noises at us and opened their beaks wide, they were spitting out the stuff, but it was only going about 4 or 5 feet. Not too dangerous. So he got just out of range of this spitting stuff, and I took a picture. And then, just up above us, we saw a giant petrel fly up away, and sure enough, there was another chick on the nest there. What a lovely island it is. The weather was not cold enough to freeze the horribly dirty mess which the penguins are paddling around in. Once, Chris caught his crampons in the wire netting he was unrolling and fell down into the mess. He either laughed or cried. It was hard to tell which. When we were satisfied that the fence was as good as we could make it, nearly 80 meters long, we retired to the tent for a cup of hot chocolate, then rolled up the wire netting ready for a drive and count tomorrow. What we do is drive the chicks from the marks of our last count through between all the fence posts to the other side, roll out and attach the wire netting, then let them return to the side they came from through the gate and around the end of the fence, counting them as they pass. When they have all settled, then we drive a similar number back from the other side. It sounds easy, but they are so completely unafraid of us that driving is quite difficult. Also, it is not easy to get the fence back up before the big push starts, and it is difficult to police all fronts. Then followed a wild, wet ride down the coast, half seen in the rain, and then suddenly out of the worst of the weather in the lee of Cape Hooker, the southeast point. The rain was torrential and very cold as I tried to see ahead to find a way into a tiny cove just inside Crawford Bay. It was very spectacular with high black lava cliffs all around, covered with countless thousands of rockhoppers, as was the surface of the cove itself, looking like kelp. About 17:20 hours, I dropped the anchor in the center of the cove in 12 fathoms, giving her all 40 fathoms of chain. By the time the anchor grabbed, we were halfway out of the cove again, but she seemed safe, and in spite of the swell which still rolled in, lay comfortably enough. There is not a lot of swinging room, but I am hoping that the backwash off the rocks will keep her away from them. Some squalls tear down over the cliffs, but Totorore is more demure than she used to be with a full mast and rigging, so it is not too serious. I could not get inside fast enough to shed my cold, wet clothes and put on something dry. This I followed with coffee laced with rum. Writing up the logbook and feeling rather lonely, I called the cove All Alone. I stayed up to keep an eye on things, still wearing wet weather gear. At about 2300 hours, I noticed that Totorore had swung into the cove to a moderate breeze from the west. At that stage, I wondered if I should move out, and now I wish I had, while I had the chance. Wednesday, 29th of January. I feel like a man returned from the dead. It is now about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I have just survived the most terrible experience. Terrible and yet wonderful. I just can't stop thanking God once again for my deliverance. It was like Miracle Cove in South Georgia again. In fact, it was worse than that. It was more like the other time when I was in my other boat at Chatham Islands in Katiga on the rocks. How on earth I survived, I just can't imagine. It just seems absolutely incredible that I could have survived this. At the moment, we are in a gale. We are about half a mile off the coast, and I'm drifting away in Totorore. The anchor is still hanging out. There are 25 fathoms of chain on the main anchor, and of course the smaller anchor hanging onto that. Well, that is acting as a little bit of a drogue to stop our drift too fast. The fact is that I just didn't have the strength to pull it up. I just couldn't. Fortunately, the wind is taking us along the coast. I have the radar running, and I can watch to see that we are not getting closer. In spite of the gale, it is actually a lovely night. There's a big moon there. There's one enormous big bank of clouds has passed away. There's another big bank coming, but at the moment I can see the moon. That lights up the whole scene. That made it easier, if one could call it that, in that cove. It was in the cove which I had just called All Alone Cove, because I felt rather lonely. I was indeed all alone. about 11 o'clock, the wind suddenly changed and started to come from the west, blowing in to this little cove. I waited a while. I thought perhaps it wouldn't amount to much, but then the sea started to build up, and the big seas came rolling in and started to break. I knew I had to get out. So around about 12 o'clock, I tried to weigh anchor. I put the auto helm on again, but it was useless. It couldn't handle it. I had the engine running. It was very, very difficult. The weight was terrific. The wind came up with tremendous force, hurricane force, in enormous squalls in very rapid succession. The water was absolutely white spray, and the spray was flung high, high into the air in these terrible willy-bores which came down from the cliffs up above. But mostly it was blowing right into the cove. I was scared, and I prayed very loudly. I struggled hard, trying to get the anchor up, running aft, tending to the engine and to the rudder, lashing the rudder. I took the auto helm off because it was no good, and it was terrible. I got so close, and we were heading for the rocks on the one side. I still had the anchor dragging. I couldn't get that last little bit up. The weight was too terrible. On my own, I just could not manage it. I tried to slack it, but then the wind caught her and she was going farther and farther in towards the rocks every time. First one side and then the other. It was an absolute nightmare. But the worst was still to come. I had it almost away, I thought. But the small anchor must have been catching on something. I thought we were in about 10 fathoms. But when I had the main anchor up to 5 fathoms, the small anchor was still catching on something with a terrible jerk, and I just couldn't get it clear. I was trying to motor ahead and get out, motoring fast, hard, but then I couldn't. She wouldn't come. And then the wind caught her again, and she started to head back fast into the cove. And I rushed aft, and just as I got there, the engine stalled, suddenly stopped. Oh God, no, what a time. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't understand why it had stalled, but I rushed forward and I tried hard to pull out the anchor again, to let it out, run out the chain. I got out to, I don't know, about 25 fathoms, but it was too late. Too late, I could see. She wouldn't pull up in time. She started to pull up, and then there was a terrible crash, and she hit the first big rock. It was a huge big rock lying close offshore. The sea lifted her right up on top of it, and then I thought she was going to turn over, because she went over on her side with another terrible crash on the keels, and then she was over that rock, and she hit on the other side on the shore itself. Oh God, I thought that was it. I really thought it was the end of the expedition, the end of Totorore, and the end of me. I was again looking to see if there any possibility of getting ashore. But even had I got ashore, the big black cliffs up above, but still, there might have been a way. And I was thinking, that work on the sail and the mast, and what a waste of time, because this is it. I've now lost everything. If I can save my life, I might be able to get back across the island to the base. I couldn't understand. She was washed back again in the waves, and I went down below and I looked at the engine. I couldn't see what was wrong. I got it started again, and I had the throttle full open, but the clutch was slipping. The propeller was all tangled in the kelp, and there was an awful clatter, and I think I might have picked up my chain somehow in it. A terrible clatter, and nothing was happening. Then I tore off the lid of the box, and the actual shaft coupling hadn't broken. The actual engine, it started again. It started and was going. I don't know how or why, but it did, and it was going. So I grabbed hold of the tiller and I gave as much throttle as I dared. And she hit again when I was running straight back onto the rock that was offshore, but I had no option. There was nothing else I could do. And she hit, and then she bounced over the top of it. It showed, at times it was 3 meters out of the water. The seas were terrible. They were breaking right over the top and right over the boat. And somehow she got over it. And she was dragging this great length of chain and anchor, 25 fathoms. I don't know how it could happen. Before, she had caught when only short chain. This time I hardly dared even to pray that I was to be saved. But dear God heard my prayers again. He must be tired of listening to so many prayers from me. Somehow we kept going, dragging this great chain with us. The squalls were terrible, and they started coming in different directions too. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear, I couldn't even think in these squalls. And once we got outside, I left the engine going, and I tried hard to wind up the anchor in case it should foul again and snub us round onto those awful rocks. We got clear into the entrance, and somehow I managed to get it up, so painfully slowly, link by link. I don't know how much is still out. I've got it dragging, hanging in the water. I got up very little, but now we are in deep water, and we are drifting off. The wind is now blowing us away along the coast. It's a bit uncomfortable. She's rolling terribly. Everything's flying about. But we're more or less under control. I just can't imagine what the damage might be underneath. The weather seems all right. I hadn't even had a chance to look at the self-steering. Those keels took a terrible hammering. I only hope nothing else took a hammering too. She doesn't seem to be leaking. Oh boy, that was a very close one. Couldn't have been closer. I've come down inside now, watching the radar out of that cold, wet place outside, and I've just had a cup of coffee. I feel a lot better. Whew, I don't know, this business of single-handing in these waters is not easy. But, praise God, I'm still alive. And really, I think that I'm probably richer for that experience. But I must certainly try hard not to repeat it. In fact, at the moment, I'm feeling pretty good. Así es la vida. I'm still alive. My boat is afloat. And she's not leaking. She's comfortable. I've had a nice cup of coffee. And life's pretty good. Once we drifted far enough offshore to be safe, I'm going to get some sleep. And I think I'll just jolly well let her drift. With all that anchor hanging down, I can't really go close inshore. I'd never get there. And at the moment, the way the wind is blowing, I can't even get the jolly thing up. So, as long as it continues to blow away from the island, I'll just have to try to get back when it all eases up. I hope that nobody back on Marian will be worried about me. I couldn't contact them on the VHF. I did try earlier, possibly once we're up on this side of the coast, I would try again, but of course there won't be anybody there now till the morning to listen. I notice that the barometer is still falling. It's now down to 982 millibars. So I don't know how long this lot is going to last. Not too long, I hope, or I might have a job to get back to the island. If I had my sails on board, that wouldn't matter so much, but unfortunately the two sails are still up in the shed. Having taken fuel and water, I've probably got enough food to last me quite a long time. I could have probably just carried on. But I really do want those two sails, so I'll have to go back. In any case, it really would be very wrong to just take off without saying goodbye to my friends on Marion, especially if I were unable to contact them on the radio. Also, I've got some very important clothes there which Christine has very kindly washed for me. Heavy shirts and things like that, and I've left my camera too. So, I don't know when I'll get back, but I will get back somehow.
We've come to a part in your voyage, Jerry, that was a very eventful part and a very frightening part for you, I guess. Tell us a little bit about this stretch of the voyage.
It was frightening in parts, but to start with, I was full of confidence that I could get back to New Zealand. In fact, I was going to get to Macquarie Island first, under jury rig, by myself. And so I set off away from Marion Island and had a good sail down to the Crozet Islands. They're owned by the French in the southern Indian Ocean. And on arrival there, I had a good look at some of the outer islands and saw some very interesting birds, really thoroughly enjoyed them. Wonderful place, beautiful place. And then went on to where they have a base, French base, and on Ile de la Possession. And there I was told that I was not allowed ashore by the French.
Why was that?
I think really because we have a New Zealand flag, of course, flying, and it wasn't very long after the Rainbow Warrior incident. And the French who met me on the beach, they asked me to come ashore on the VHF radio to bring my papers. So I rowed ashore, and they met me there and said, "We are very sorry, this is not French hospitality, but Paris has ordered that you should not come ashore." And so they said, "Is there anything you would like?" And I said, "Yes, please, a hot shower." And they said, "We are very sorry, there is not one down here on the beach." And that was as far as I was allowed to go, which was really quite amusing.
What about from there? You went further north, didn't you, then? Or?
No, I went a little farther south then, down to Kerguelen Islands, which are also French. Again, had a wonderful time. And there the French did allow me ashore and treated me extremely well.
Or maybe the message didn't get through to them.
I think Crozet must have called through on the radio and said, "Look, this is a chap who's in a disabled boat and he's on his own. He's really no great threat to anybody." I think that's probably what happened.
Right.
And they received me very well indeed, and I was allowed to go ashore and shower and take my clothes and use their washing machine, and they fed me very well a couple of days that I was there. And they actually filled me up with all the stores I could carry. They would have sunk the boat with stores if I'd have let them. They gave me so much diesel and food and 10 big bottles of good French wine. So they were really very good. And after that, I set off then to Heard Island, which is farther south again, and belongs to Australia and is uninhabited. It used to have a base, but that was abandoned in 1955. But a really fascinating place, and it was interesting to see what birds were there. This was in April. The weather there was pretty awful. In Kerguelen, the winds reach on an average gale force every day. But I really do think that in Heard Island it was worse. But it was a beautiful place, and I enjoyed my stay. I was only able to get ashore twice, but I picked up a piece of wood that I thought I could use to improve my self-steering somehow, putting it on the sail as a sort of a boom, because my self-steering had broken off in a gale, and I just could not stay out at the tiller very long because it was so cold. Anyway, I set off from Heard Island after 10 days, and then met the worst storm I've ever met in my life. Oh, not quite. It was the one followed was even worse. But in that first storm, which was really horrendous, the boat was rolled over twice, completely, and I lost my jury. spinnaker pole was smashed in the storm, but I still have one end which I may be able to use to lengthen the wooden pole. Probably it too will go in the next storm, but I will worry about that when it happens, and hope to get many miles of sailing with it first. The only depressing thing about it at the moment is that it will take me a few days to rig it, so we still won't make any progress until it is complete. Thursday the 24th of April. The worst day yet. Hurricane force wind and incredibly huge and murderous seas. We were rolled right over 3 times. One cannot describe the terror. I cut my head, blood everywhere, and sprained my thumb. My neck hurts, and I'm scared that I have damaged something serious. Water poured in, locker doors burst open, everywhere a complete shambles. The only good thing was that at least it was daylight this time. The radar has gone. The tiller was smashed, and I fear for the rudder, which is thrashing madly about. The railings were torn off the coach roof with the weight of water on the main boom and other spars. Port lifelines bent right over. Inside was 1-inch steel bar stiffening. My hopes of survival were almost extinguished. There is very little left on board that is dry. I was dazed with shock and cannot say how much time elapsed between the capsizes. Probably an hour or so. I remember seeing all the blood and thinking, it doesn't matter, I'm going to die anyway. Each time she was rolled over, she came up heading in the opposite direction. I remember saying aloud after the second time, at least that has headed her back near her course. I think I was suffering from hypothermia, as I began to feel very calm and resigned to my fate. I was soaked to the skin with seawater only 1 degree above freezing, and I stayed that way all day, thinking that as I was already numb with cold, I would die more quickly, which would be good. Automatically I kept pumping out the water and trying to get some order back in the cabin, but all the while I kept praying. In the evening, quite surprised to be still alive, I thanked God and promised to do all that I could to try to stay that way. Only then did I change into less wet clothes. I had a little laugh when I thought of what Jim Watt would have said. Everything in our favor is against us. Friday, 25th of April. The storm moderated during the night. In the morning I fitted the spare tiller, a difficult job in the conditions, and then had to jettison the fuel cans on deck, as there's nothing left to secure them to. Also the tattered remains of the big whale sail, and the main boom and mainsail, which I had thought of as last resort spare. I lashed the few remaining bits of wood, old oars, the small spar from Herd Island, etc., down near the scupper on the coach roof, hoping that they will offer less resistance, but stay there, in case I get a chance to rig some sort of sail. To give the seas a clean sweep across the deck, I even jettisoned the life raft. It is no good to me here, but I was reluctant to part with it, as one never knows the circumstances close to a coast somewhere, if ever I get to such a comparatively happy position. However, my first consideration now is to try to survive right here. So I cast it over, having secured the painter. It was a 4-man Avon, and I have had it since 1970, so it was quite a friend, and I felt sad to treat it so meanly. It was, of course, long overdue its annual servicing. Wanting to actually see it inflated myself for the first time, and the last, I tugged as hard as I could on its painter, but nothing happened. I thought that I would have been upset if I had been actually wanting to use it in a hurry. Thinking that the movement of the sea might do the trick, I pulled it up short on the painter and left it. After about 3/4 of an hour, suddenly it worked, and there it was in all its red and black glory. It looked wonderful, although very small for 4 people. I thought I ought to scrawl a message on it in case one day somebody sees it, but in present conditions everything is so difficult, so I did not bother. I also wondered if I should remove anything from it which might be useful, but for the same reason I did not bother, and saying goodbye and sorry to it, I set it adrift. Every now and again, for quite a long time, I had brief glimpses of it on the crests of waves. But it did make me realize how difficult it would be to spot one from a small surface craft. As far as messages are concerned, I have launched a few in bottles, asking the finder to pass them on to Marjorie and giving the date and position as far as I could estimate. I have taken a couple of sights, but they were not very good in these impossible conditions, and in any case, exactly where we are at the moment is one of the least of my worries. 26th of April. Life is pretty grim, as I have no lights except for 2 hurricane lamps now, both of which got broken, but still work after a fashion. It is very cold. I worked all day on deck, as the weather was quite good, and rigged my jury mast number 4. I don't know what chance it has of lasting. I managed to erect it, but still need to work some more on it. Keeping busy helps me to keep my mind off things, but the nights are the worst. I have one less wet, only damp sleeping bag, which I only dare use if the weather is very good, but mostly it stays in a plastic bag. The words of a popular song of a few years ago keep going through my head, and I find myself frequently singing, rather grimly. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Tomorrow you're gonna die. 27th of April. Good weather again, so I tackled the engine job. The cylinder head is very bad, but I'm hoping that with plenty of gasket goo it might work enough to keep the batteries charged, if I do not put the engine into gear. I was not able to complete the job, as it is nearly dark. When it is overcast, at only about 1600 hours. It will be worse in the winter, but I shall probably not live to see it. It is so easy to be wise afterwards, and of course I'm feeling very stupid for being here at all. I thought it would be no worse than when Mike and I crossed the Pacific. And I was rather misled by the pilot, which shows only between 5 and 10% gales for this area. I had not expected to lose the mast again, and I had reckoned to have the engine with all that extra fuel on board. Coming south, almost following the Great Circle until too close to ice, seemed the best thing to do, being shortest. If only I had had more sense and kept on a rum line from Crozet towards Fremantle. But on the other hand, at this time of year, I would have had mostly easterlies, easterly winds, and I could not possibly have arrived anywhere like that. What a waste of my life, when it still had so much to offer with my lovely family. I will never even know if my second grandchild is boy or girl. I feel so very sad of the incomplete nature of everything, and feel that it is a most unsatisfactory way to leave the world with so much undone. I pray constantly, but it would need a mighty miracle to get me out of this mess now. However, I find it a good discipline and a morale booster to always start my prayers by saying thank you to God. And however bad the situation is, I can really always find plenty of good things to say thank you for. Usually I start by saying thank you that I am still alive. And I always include special thanks that my gas stove still works and I am able to have hot food. Without that, life would have been pretty miserable. All in all, I suppose that really I am a very lucky fellow. And I have a wonderful little boat, which has stood up to incredible punishment. Long live Totorore. Monday, 28th of April. My sights showed very little progress in the westerly current. but that the northwest winds are pushing us farther south towards the ice, unless I can get some sort of a sail to keep up to the north. Early morning, which I long for as the nights are so long and I cannot sleep. I wish I had sleeping pills. I rigged up the orange sail on the new mast, but as the mast is only 12 feet high, it did not set well, and we are hardly moving. I carried on, working on the engine, but I cannot get it to work. I have not the strength to start it by hand, but there is something still very wrong with it. My batteries are nearly flat. I will try once more tomorrow, but after that there will be nothing more I can do. It would have been so nice to have the occasional warmth to dry out some clothes. I am tempted to step over the side and call it a day. But where there is life there is hope, and it would seem wrong not to keep on battling. Never give in, said Winston Churchill. Besides which, I'm a coward. At this stage, I can't face the thought of that icy water. My guess is that soon I will have no option. I try to keep my spirits up by carrying on as normal, trying to keep the boat a bit clean and tidy, although I have not been able to finish cleaning up the mess after rolling over. I am trying to get things stowed and secured so they won't fly about the next time it happens, which heaven forbid. And I have endeavoured to block up the ventilators, a job not finished yet. I think there is only one vent cowl left now. I tried some rubber sealing on the washboard, but it does not stick on very well. It is too cold for most of the glue. I crack a few jokes to myself and sing little songs, but the one that seems to come up most often is, I'm tired and I want to go home. I have not yet re-rigged the self-steering vane to the tiller. The braces to the whole bracket were bent by the sea in the last storm, and of course all my blocks and cords became disorganized, so another similar storm could finish it off. Meanwhile, she can only sail with wind abeam, so with a westerly wind she heads north, which is a slight counter to the southward pushes she keeps getting. And I left the sail up when I took to my bunk. Every little helps. At about 0100 hours, the big thumps and splashes told me that trouble was on the way. Sure enough, the barometer was falling, and the wind had gone northwest, which is always the bad one. I struggled into my wet weather gear in the dark. Oh, how I miss those lights. And was very thankful to the invisible moon, which cast some light to help me with my work outside. I took off the sail, then lowered my precious little mast to the deck, then took it all down into the cabin and lashed it securely. This is just about my last hope, this tiny mast, so I must care for it as best I can. The whole job took me nearly 2 hours, fumbling in the dark with numb fingers and getting very wet again. When it is rough, I sleep in my wet sleeping bag, wearing all my clothes and my sea boots. My wet pillow is in a plastic bag. Not very comfortable, but I do eventually warm up inside there. I was so glad the blow did not come to much. Those storms terrify me. Early in the morning, I re-rigged the mast, hoisted the sail again, and worked on the self-steering. I never did have a chance to get back to the engine today. Anyway, the wind gradually backed to southwest, usually the best weather, even though cold with snow, and by 1500 hours I actually had her running downwind, steering herself. If a big sea knocks her off course, she cannot rectify it, but if I put her on course, she holds it. The speed came up to about 3 knots. Fantastic. We have no electric power, so have no log and can only guess. I was thrilled to bits. The nearest to progress since the Marion Island mast came down 10 days ago. A ray of sunshine with a glimmer of hope. Everything up forward there is rather frail and probably cannot last the distance, but it is doing the job at this moment, and that is definitely cheering. If only the good God can spare me from those terrible storms.
It was about 2.5 months before you actually made Fremantle, wasn't it?
Yes.
No, but you ran into a spot of bother just outside of Fremantle.
Oh yes, that was one of my worries. Having got out of the furious 50s and into the comparatively gentle roaring 40s, I found, I thought I had much more chance, but I was always worried about arriving on a lee shore. For a time I'd been unable to get north at all, and I thought I'd end up possibly on the coast of Tasmania, which would be a very long lee coast, a very dangerous rocky place. I was always scared of that, and to a small extent that happened to me before arriving in Fremantle. I spent a night trying to claw off ashore with the wind blowing me straight onto it. And it was a very long night. I spent 14 hours at the tiller without a break. It wasn't a strong wind, but the swell was constantly taking her in closer. And the rocks were there, and I could see them by moonlight. I could see the breakers on them, and it was very worrying.
How did the New Zealand America's Cup Challenge syndicate in Fremantle then make it possible for you to return home and pretty well save you there?
Well, Michael Fay had, when he came to see the boat, he said, "Oh, we can't see a Kiwi boat go home like this. We'll do what we can to help you." And they did by giving us materials and the use of their workshop, and quite a lot of help in their workshop whenever their boats were out and they weren't too busy. Their various staff, their technicians and riggers were able to lend us a hand, and we really did have tremendous amount done for us by them. They were just wonderful to us, and so we were able to completely re-rig the boat. We managed to buy a mast which had been damaged and got it fairly cheap in the town there, and they helped us in so many ways. But a lot of the local people in Fremantle were very, very good too. People would come down to the boat and say, "Oh, what can we do to help?" And used to take them up on it as well. They were just wonderful, and we were given sails and other sails bought extremely cheaply, and by the time we sailed away from there in 2 months after arrival, we were in pretty good shape, really.
Jerry, what was it like when you finally ended your voyage up Kerikeri Inlet?
Oh, well, to me, really, that was, I would say, the highlight of the voyage for me. It was just such a wonderful, heartwarming experience. I had a tremendous welcome. I was just so overflowing with love and happiness. It was terrific. Well, right now I just feel absolutely overflowing with love and with happiness. Sorry.
Is it because there's just not enough people, not many people around, that you get excited about anything that moves in the skyline or anywhere around you?
Oh, well, I'm just always interested in birds. In fact, quite honestly, I love the places where there aren't any people rather more than places where there are. But I'm perhaps a little unsociable.